Hollywood's golden age, the land of dazzling smiles, velvet gowns, and 1,000 sparkling secrets. But what if I told you some of the era's brightest stars were battling monsters you couldn't see? The truth is, many icons who lit up the silver screen were hiding shadows that never made it past the marquee. How well do you really know your legends? Stay tuned, because behind the red carpet glitz, these 25 stars were fighting battles you never saw coming. Ready to have your illusions shattered? Let's go. Marilyn Monroe. Let's start with the ultimate American icon. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just the breathy voice, the platinum hair, and that infamous subway great moment. She was also a walking paradox, a woman who could own any room, yet always felt like she didn't belong in it. Monroe's childhood was marked by chaos, bouncing between foster homes, each one teaching her a new lesson about loneliness. As she rose to fame, the world saw the glamour, but never the nightly anxiety, the deep-rooted sense of being unworthy, or the constant feeling of being watched. Monroe's anxiety wasn't just stage fright, it seeped into every relationship, every movie set, every script she tried to memorize. She often arrived late or didn't show up at all, sending studio executives into panic mode. Was it diva behavior? Hardly. It was crippling fear, fear of failing, fear of being found out as a fraud, fear of being abandoned yet again. Off-screen, Monroe relied on a cocktail of prescription pills just to sleep, just to function, just to show up. The public called her unreliable, but the truth was, she was fighting to survive a relentless inner storm. Her beauty was legendary, but her vulnerability? That was the real secret Hollywood never wanted you to see. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh was the queen of Southern fire, immortalized as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. Audiences saw the diamonds, the passion, the relentless drive. But behind closed doors, Vivien was riding a roller coaster called bipolar disorder, a term Hollywood didn't dare whisper, let alone acknowledge. Her emotional highs would turn her into a whirlwind of energy and ideas, keeping everyone around her guessing. She would talk endlessly, jump from project to project, and dazzle crowds with her wit and sparkle. Then, just as suddenly, the world would turn dark. She'd vanish for days, paralyzed by crushing lows. Sometimes she couldn't get out of bed, couldn't face another camera flash, couldn't bear another line of dialogue. Her marriage to Laurence Olivier, Hollywood's ultimate power couple, was a battleground, with love colliding with the harsh reality of a mind at war with itself. Vivien's outbursts on set became the stuff of gossip column legend. Studios whispered that she was difficult, but the truth was, she was fighting battles the world refused to see. She was eventually forced to step back from Hollywood, her career slowing as her illness gained ground. For all her Oscars, for all the fame, Vivien Leigh remains a heartbreaking reminder. Even the brightest stars can burn themselves out fighting the darkness. Judy Garland. Dorothy Gale skipped down the yellow brick road straight into the jaws of Hollywood. Judy Garland was a teenage powerhouse, blessed with a voice that could break your heart and a face you'd never forget. But behind those sparkling eyes was a mind weighed down by the studio system's ruthless demands. Garland was pushed to lose weight, pushed to work late, pushed until the word rest lost all meaning. Pills were the studio's solution, one to wake up, one to sleep, and another to keep performing when her nerves were shot. The result? Lifelong anxiety, deep depression, and a dependence on medication just to get through the day. Garland's stage fright could be so intense she'd panic before performances, trembling in the wings while audiences waited. The world saw her as the girl next door, but privately, Judy's life was a blur of breakdowns, missed opportunities, and tearful nights alone. She loved her children, adored her fans, but struggled to believe she was ever enough. Garland was living proof that talent and torment can share the same stage. The girl who took us over the rainbow spent her life searching for a happiness she could never quite reach. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was the brooding heartthrob who could break your heart with a single glance. On screen, he defined the tortured outsider, the misunderstood rebel, the man always on the edge. Off-screen, that edge was razor-sharp. After a devastating car crash, Clift's face and career were forever changed. Hollywood loved his looks, but after the accident, he was forced to confront a brutal new reality, one filled with pain, surgeries, and self-doubt. The physical scars were only half the story. Inside, Clift battled severe depression and growing addiction to painkillers and alcohol. Friends described him as haunted, drifting through life with a sadness that seemed to seep from his very pores. He turned down roles, disappeared for weeks, and pushed away people who tried to help. But Clift refused to quit. He delivered powerful performances even when the world wrote him off. Still, the cost was staggering. By the end, Clift was a shadow of the promising star he once was. His life reads like a Greek tragedy: fame, beauty, pain, and the relentless pursuit of an inner peace that always stayed just out of reach. Tierney. Jean Tierney was the face you couldn't forget. Her beauty nearly otherworldly in classics like Lorre and Leave Her to Heaven. But if you thought her life was a Hollywood fairy tale, think again. Tierney's mental health battles nearly destroyed her, dragging her from glamorous premieres to the locked wards of psychiatric hospitals. Her depression was so severe, she suffered psychotic breaks, losing touch with reality for days at a time. Tierney's private agony was made worse by a string of tragedies. Her first child was born with severe disabilities, a heartbreak that haunted Jean for life. As her condition worsened, she was subjected to the era's brutal treatments: electroshock therapy, isolation, and medications that left her numb. At the height of her fame, she simply disappeared. Studio bosses inventing cover stories while she fought for her mind in silence. She survived, but her comeback was a quiet one. The glitz never mattered to Tierney as much as just feeling normal again. Her story is a gut punch, a reminder that behind the beauty, even the most flawless faces can be hiding scars nobody sees. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth wasn't just Hollywood's red-haired goddess. She was the dream that every war-weary soldier pinned to his locker, the icon of romance and elegance. But the world didn't see the cracks forming beneath the glamorous surface. By the 1960s, Hayworth was losing more than just her place at the top of the marquee. She was losing herself. Early signs of confusion and erratic behavior were whispered about in the press, but nobody guessed the truth. Rita was in the grip of early-onset Alzheimer's, a diagnosis that barely existed in the public's mind at the time. As her memory faltered, directors grew frustrated, colleagues distanced themselves, and the headlines turned harsh. Family members watched in heartbreak as Rita's sharp wit dulled and her legendary beauty faded. The depression that came with her illness was crushing, her vibrant life shrinking into a haze of forgotten names and lost years. Once the queen of the screen, Rita now struggled just to remember lines or even her own past. Hollywood is built on the illusion of forever, but Rita Hayworth's story proved even icons can't escape the mind's unraveling. The world remembers her as Gilda, but her greatest fight was the one nobody wanted to talk about: a slow, heartbreaking descent that changed how America understood memory and loss. Lorre. Peter Lorre was the face of cinematic unease. He played creeps, criminals, and outcasts with such conviction that audiences never questioned the haunted look in his eyes. But here's the twist: those shadows weren't all acting. Lorre's real-life battle with depression and anxiety was as relentless as any villain he ever played. Born into a life of upheaval and exile, Lorre brought a sense of isolation to every role, channeling his private fears into performances that still unsettle viewers today. Off-screen, the pressure to stay relevant and interesting gnawed at him. Lorre's unique appearance and heavy accent set him apart in Hollywood, but it also made him an outsider at every cocktail party. He drifted through marriages and friendships, haunted by nightmares and bouts of despair he could never quite shake. Friends described him as melancholic, a man who could make a room laugh while quietly battling invisible demons. In the end, Lorre's health crumbled under the strain of his emotional turmoil, his later years marked by declining roles and personal disappointments. The legacy he left was more than just classic movies. It was proof that even those who bring our darkest fears to life on screen can be struggling hardest in the shadows. Frances Farmer. If you want to know what happens when Hollywood meets mental illness in the most brutal way, look no further than Frances Farmer. She burst onto the scene with raw talent and rebellious energy, refusing to play by the rules in an industry obsessed with conformity. Her outspokenness, once celebrated, quickly became her downfall. When Farmer began exhibiting signs of depression and paranoia, the studios called her difficult, and tried to silence her. The press painted her as wild and unpredictable, but no one cared to see the agony underneath. Farmer's spiral was as public as it was tragic. She was diagnosed with severe depression, maybe even schizophrenia, and institutionalized against her will. The treatments of the era were harsh: electroshock, isolation, and a medical system that preferred sedation over empathy. At the height of her talent, Farmer was locked away, forgotten by the industry that once begged for her attention. She fought to return, but Hollywood wasn't forgiving. Despite all odds, Frances Farmer's name endures, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of how easily a star can be shattered by both mental illness and the machinery built to hide it. Spencer Tracy. When you picture classic Hollywood, Spencer Tracy is the solid, dependable anchor, the moral center of every story. But for Tracy, stability was a mirage. Privately, he was tormented by relentless depression and a dependence on alcohol that nearly derailed his life and career. The pressure to appear tough and unshakable only made things worse, turning Tracy's personal battles into a private hell. He drank to cope with guilt, regret, and the demands of always being on. Tracy's relationships, especially his famous romance with Katharine Hepburn, were tumultuous, riddled with emotional highs and lows. The studio system's need for perfect leading men meant his struggles had to be kept under wraps. Colleagues and friends whispered about his disappearances, his black moods, and his unpredictable temper, but the public saw only Oscar-winning greatness. Through it all, Tracy kept working, even as the cracks widened. His pain bled into his performances, adding layers of humanity to every role. He showed the world that even legends aren't immune to the weight of sadness, and sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one fighting the hardest just to show up. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton's story is a Hollywood cautionary tale that almost nobody wants to remember. She arrived as a blonde bombshell, a new starlet destined for big things. But beneath the surface, Payton was locked in a war with depression and a relentless need to numb her pain. The industry was cruel, handing out fame one day and scandal the next. She spiraled quickly, burning through relationships, alienating studios, and picking fights with her own reputation. Behind the headlines about bad choices and wild nights was a woman tormented by emotional darkness. Her mood swings were legendary, but instead of help, she was met with mockery and rejection. Mental illness in the 1950s was just another punchline for gossip columns, and Payton took every blow in public. The roles dried up, friends vanished, and the only thing that seemed to stick around was her sense of being lost. By the end, Payton was a Hollywood ghost, her name whispered as a warning rather than a celebration. Her story is proof that the industry that builds up its darlings can just as quickly turn its back on those who struggle, and that mental illness doesn't care how famous your name is on the marquee. Lionel Barrymore. Picture this: a member of Hollywood's original royalty, beloved by audiences for roles like the grumpy Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, and as the patriarch of the Barrymore acting dynasty. But Lionel Barrymore's greatest battle wasn't with a villain on screen. It was with the relentless shadows in his mind. Throughout his golden years, Lionel's public image was that of a wise, sometimes crusty, grandfather figure. But away from the cameras, he was locked in a cycle of chronic depression and worsening health. Barrymore's life wasn't just a tale of red carpets and curtain calls. Chronic pain from arthritis left him wheelchair-bound, and that physical agony only deepened his depression. Hollywood execs, and even his own family, often tried to keep his struggles quiet, terrified that the public might lose faith in one of their favorite father figures. But behind closed doors, Lionel's drinking became more frequent and his mood more unpredictable. Yet, despite all the darkness, Barrymore remained a powerhouse performer. He pushed through the pain, literally and emotionally, to leave a film legacy that's still celebrated today. His story isn't just about triumph over adversity, it's about what happens when a legend's greatest struggle is with himself, not his audience. Bette Davis. If you think Hollywood is a game for the fearless, you haven't met Bette Davis. She was the original queen of attitude, never afraid to clash with studios, directors, or even her rivals. But Davis's real nemesis wasn't Joan Crawford or a bad script. It was the ever-creeping anxiety that gnawed at her from within. While Davis could command any screen with icy stares and razor-sharp dialogue, Inside, she was always fighting the fear that her reign might end at any second. Her later years were especially turbulent. The pressure to stay relevant in a business obsessed with youth left Davis perpetually on edge, scanning every headline for signs her time was up. Colleagues described her as brilliant but paranoid, quick to suspect betrayal, and fiercely protective of her status. Some saw her as difficult, but much of her legendary temper was driven by a private panic that everything could be taken away overnight. Even so, Bette Davis didn't let anxiety win. She kept acting, kept winning awards, and kept proving that raw talent and sheer willpower can sometimes silence the loudest inner critics. But the scars of living in constant fear? Those she carried with her right to the end. Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was more than a pretty face. She was a bona fide genius who co-invented a technology that paved the way for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But the mind that helped reshape modern communications was also a mind beset by doubt, anxiety, and waves of deep sadness. Hollywood marketed Hedy as the most beautiful woman in the world, but privately, she struggled to find her place in an industry that only wanted her for her looks. Lamar's brilliance often made her an outsider, and as the roles dried up, her sense of isolation grew sharper. She withdrew from friends, grew suspicious of everyone, and drifted into long periods of depression. She was dogged by a string of failed marriages and lawsuits that only amplified her loneliness. The glitz and glamour of Hollywood felt like a prison cell, and by the end, Lamarr lived in near total seclusion. What's wild is that a woman responsible for such groundbreaking ideas could feel so voiceless in her own life. Her story is a gut punch, proof that the world's brightest minds can be the most misunderstood, and that genius doesn't always save you from yourself. James Dean. James Dean was the rebel without a cause, the moody icon who became a symbol of restless youth for generations. But that iconic scowl? It wasn't just for the cameras. Dean's real life was a series of emotional earthquakes, shaped by early trauma, the loss of his mother, a distant father, and a constant fear of abandonment. Even at the height of his short career, Dean carried a loneliness that no amount of adoration could fill. On set, he was unpredictable, sometimes brilliant, sometimes brooding, often wrestling with a sadness that refused to let go. Friends and directors described him as mercurial, caught between moments of wild energy and hours of deep melancholy. Hollywood called it method acting, but much of Dean's screen magic came from the raw pain he felt every day. Dean's untimely death sealed his legend, but it also froze him in time, forever the young man whose battles with depression were always just beneath the surface. His legacy? A warning that sometimes the world's biggest stars are the ones who feel the most alone.